Welcome to day 3 of Advance Tomorrow, the Prospect Development Virtual Experience. My name is Roger Devine, and I'm a volunteer with Apra. I'm connecting with all of you today from Los Angeles, California, and I'm especially grateful for the advanced technology, video streaming, and social media capabilities that are allowing us to come together safely, regardless of geographic distance. This past week, I've had the distinct pleasure of meeting several first-time attendees, as well as seeing many friends across the Apra community. For those of you on social media, the Apra fashion hashtag is real and just as strong as ever. I'd also be remiss if I didn't mention that the presentation memes are quirky, on point, and just what I needed to lift my spirits this year. For those joining us for the first time, Apra Talks has a long and rich tradition of convening presentations, discussions, big ideas, and spirited debates on hot topics in prospect development, covering everything from organizational change, leadership, innovation, workplace culture, social media, and data science, you name it. The theme of Apra Talks this year is information overload and navigating the landscape of tools and technology. With new tools and technologies emerging at record pace in the landscape, are we doing enough to critically evaluate these tools that we're using? And are these tools actually improving our work, or are they just the next new shiny thing? Today, we've invited several thought leaders to share their perspectives on the rapid evolution of technology advancement in our sectors, which also motivates contextual inquiry into data quality, verification, ethics, equity, and organizational development dimensions and considerations. Part conversation, part debate. This session will help us think critically about the tools that are shaping our work in industries now and over the decades to come. One quick reminder about the conference platform. Please remember to use the green social Q&A box under the session description on the website to ask questions during the session, which your peers can interactively upvote to prioritize response during Q&A. Without further ado, it is my distinct pleasure to welcome Jenny Johnson, the Director of the Family Philanthropy Resource Center at the Minneapolis Foundation, and Katie Turcotte, the Deputy Vice President at George Mason University's Office of Advancement and Alumni Relations. Welcome, Jenny and Katie. The topic of our first talk is verification, necessary or not. For this talk, let's dive right into some lived experience and valuable insights on strategic information management from the frontline perspective. So Katie, with all of these vendor solutions and push button research profiles and tools out there, can you share your thoughts on whether prospect development should be sharing unverified resources directly with our gift officers on the front line?
So Katie, I'm not Jenny. So hi, everybody.
Roger.
Of course, Jenny's having some technical issue, but Roger, we practiced this and you are ready to do your jazz dance show for us. So Roger, what we're going to do is we're going to switch the speakers. So we're going to ask Steve and Celeste to go first. So let's redo that and then we'll get Jenny on in about 15 minutes. So
Sure.
Roger and Katie and the speakers, let's try that again.
Sounds good. So for our captive audience today, we're flexible and we will pivot. And for many of you who are patching in remotely today, you know that this year has been full of surprises and curves. So for now, please allow me to welcome Celeste Bannon-Waterman, partner with KCI and head of the Research and Analytics Division, and Steve Grimes, Assistant Director of the Mayor's Office of Data Analytics of the City of New York. The topic of our discussion will be artificial intelligence, use it or lose it, or something in between, which will explore some of the potential benefits, costs, and risks that we should be keeping in mind when implementing AI solutions in the context of fundraising, specifically for organizations along a spectrum of sizes, types, and analytic maturity levels. So, Steve, AI offers and conjures so many different thoughts, ranging from Terminator movies, Skynet, OMG, to holographic computer interfaces and autonomous vehicles like we saw in Minority Report. Can you speak to some of the potential benefits that you see with AI in our fundraising sector?
Sure, and I want to first thank APRA for having me here today. I know this isn't the order that we wanted to be in, but just one of the beauties of what it is to work from home, work remotely. If anything, it's a reminder to hug your IT guy when we get back to the office. Um, so, um, for me, at least from my perspective, fundraising is an industry that is driven by emotion. We send our appeals to our donors, and try to tap into our emotion. When we give an event, we want to make sure everyone feels great. When our frontline gift officers are headed out to speak to those donors, they want to connect with them in an emotional way, along with obviously and any other way that you can to get them into the fold. And I think part of the issue that people tend to have with AI is that, or at least the promise of AI within fundraising, is that it seems to almost like take out that emotion out of our jobs, right? People are sort of afraid of what it means to have an algorithm make a choice for you because it can't feel. However, I will argue that AI, just as we do with analytics, right, and keep in mind that AI is just an automated way of doing analytics, can make sense of all of those sort of guttural feelings that we have amongst our donors, our constituents, to create those efficiencies in a way that fully maximizes our time and our efforts and our bandwidth. So we have vendors, for example, that will identify when is the right time to send out an email to donors, to invite them to an event, to invite them for a phone call, and even provide you the text that's necessary to essentially make sure that they respond. As at least from what I understand, in speaking with some of the frontline fundraisers that I have worked with, it is clear that being able to put yourself in a position where you have all the time in the world to focus on the things that matter is important. And AI can get us to that point. It is not a tool that will essentially make us automatons and just have us follow, zeros and ones. It's one that allows us to be in a position where we can go ahead and make the best decisions with the data that's in front of us, particularly in an automated way.
Steve, thanks for opening with that perspective. Celeste, what do you make of the promise of AI and some of these efficiencies and new capabilities that Steve just shared with us?
Well, I agree. I mean, obviously, I'm in analytics. I think there's huge potential and power in the ability of AI to take away some of that routine work so that we can leverage people to do what they do best, which is that emotional piece. But the part that I just want to urge some caution on is the fact that what AI, at least right now, is doing is taking some of what the human brain is also really good at doing, which is pattern recognition. It's spotting things that happen repeatedly, and instead of us having to deal with it, it does it for us, right? And it brings forward, trends and patterns and all kinds of great insights based on historical data. But the risk that I see here, and I just want to raise as we think about the power, is the fact that even when we look at ourselves as human beings, our own pattern recognition sometimes leads us to make hasty decisions based on not enough data, incomplete data, snap decisions. We call that bias, right, and discrimination. And there's the risk around AI, I think, is that it can bring forward and frankly strengthen and perpetuate some of those biases and discriminations that I think we just really want to be cautious on. And so I'm just going to shout out like one really good example, and this will be in the reference list I know afterwards, is an article I saw recently from Yasmin Green, who heads Jigsaw. It's one of the divisions at Google. And she wrote an article about this risk of bias in AI, and she cited two key examples. One was about an AI model they had built to flag hate speech, which you can understand why Google would be interested in that, of course. But what they were finding is it was just because of the information the data was drawn from, it was flagging things that were actually very positive, such as they used the sentence, "I am a proud gay man," as being hate speech, just because the word risque when it is used. In most references, it's so very negative that it became, overall weighted negative. That's a really simple example and one that we can watch for as humans. But I think it leads us to think about what are the ones we aren't so quick to see and spot, and be aware and vigilant for that. But the other example she cited that actually really concerned me even more was another algorithm that was based on what job searchers were actually responding to, the job ads they were clicking on and the ones they were applying for, was automating what jobs it was presenting to them and trying to help them basically in their search, right? As we know the automated systems do for us right now. But what they were seeing is this trend where we've heard about of women believing they have to meet more of the qualifications to apply for a job than men tend to, and I'm in no way making that a blanket statement, I'm just pulling from our article. But what they were finding is that was happening, so the AI was showing women slightly lower grade jobs than it was showing men, but then as those jobs were looked at by those two groups, they were finding it was actually starting to drift even further. Because the women then basically you start to change your expectations based on what you see, and you start to self-respond to that. And the risk is you don't see that kind of self-bias and self-discrimination, I think, is the bigger risk. And so when we think about AI, especially in the fundraising world, I mean, there's simple examples here too, like when you think about historical practice, many of the participants in the room will probably nod their head when I say this. Once upon a time, if a mixed gender couple gave a gift, the rule was to credit it to the man's record. And if you think about that historical data that's now living in all our databases, that's one we can watch for, but what are the ones we aren't watching for? What's the bias out there that's living in call reports and how we've rated people and how we've described people? I know this is a real hot topic this particular week around talking about, awareness of bias and discrimination. Let's just keep that going forward when we talk about AI.
Steve, Celeste has raised some really important considerations for us to keep in mind when we're implementing solutions and we're thinking about the data that we have in our respective institutions and how some of the decision rules and business rules that emerge. What are your thoughts about this trade-off between the efficiencies that we can potentially gain through AI and this other important lens that we need to keep top of mind?
Yeah, no, Celeste and I are definitely in agreement there with being careful of the biases that come along with AI and analytics overall. To that end, I argue for making sure that the team, the individual, the people involved on your organization understand the rigor that is involved, not just the AI, but any sort of analytics, right? It's not enough to essentially create a fancy model or give a fancy technique towards a deliverable. You would want the same rigor for any other part of your organization, right? You don't want your accountant just to give you fancy numbers. You don't want the operations persons just to have, all the fancy tools to do the job. Like things need to be done in a way that is aligned to the organization. So, your level of rigor is going to depend on the organizational maturity of the organization. Like if you are a young organization, your rigor may come along around data governance and making sure that people are putting things into where they need to be within your CRM. If you are a more mature organization, it may be around making sure there's proper QA for all of the techniques that you're actually going to do around your models. But I guess what's key to all of that is to understand where your organization is at the time and where it wants to go. And that's going to be something that's a little bit harder. I mean, I know this is an AI talk, and we're kind of drifting into what it is to run an organization in particular ways. But really, AI is a tool, and you need to know how to use that tool properly. And that starts with leadership understanding where they are and what they want to do, and making sure that they are putting people in place that fully understand that vision and are aligned to it appropriately.
Some of the themes that just emerged as you were both sharing your perspectives are tools. And some participants today might be looking through the lens of their organization saying, okay, you've talked about models, some vendor solutions, build or buy. What about, how do I get started, right? And you talked about data and data governance and tools and some of these methods. What do you think about these tools and methodologies? How does someone today kind of get access and get started with AI on their roadmap for their particular shop, big or small?
Well, in terms of that, I think, as Steve talked about, a lot of AI starts with analytics. And I think there's a lot of basic reporting and good data governance that people can get started with right now. But in the bigger picture, I do think one of the things we need to be talking about as a sector and as practitioners is what I call the democratization of AI, because I am concerned about the fact that some of this the need for governance and tools and QA and not to critique Steve, because we actually quite agree on this, but that starts to feel like a barrier to entry to me. And one of my concerns around this is we're seeing this increasing income inequality among people. We're seeing it with charities too. I was just looking at a Chronicle Philanthropy article just the other day that said the 100 biggest charities in the US grew by like 11% in 2018 in terms of revenue, even though the total philanthropic revenue in the States was actually shrinking slightly. And to me, that just is emblematic of, I think, a bigger picture concern, which is as we all become more used to AI in our daily lives, we get used to that responsiveness, we're going to become, I think, increasingly frustrated and almost intolerant of organizations that don't keep up. So not to put fear into those of you who are with smaller organizations, but this is, I think, a challenge for the organization overall, is to be thinking about how are we going to make sure that those small organizations, the ones that are frankly doing grassroots work and serving some of the most vulnerable people, don't get left behind in this. So the two things I would say to the group here today is I would challenge vendors, first of all, to be thinking about their pricing models, about the solutions they're offering, and how they really make sure that it is accessible. And the other thing I would say to all of us, and those of us who are in the space, is to be thinking about how we're sharing our knowledge and learning and what we're doing with those who might not be able to have this access. So some of what Steve's talking about, right, is good data governance. Think about how you're storing your data, how you're doing your reporting, some of that basic stuff. That's important for us to be talking about and making people realize that those are the fundamental building blocks for AI, frankly.
Steve, what are your thoughts or response to this democratization of AI and access? For some of our participants today wondering, okay, how do I get started? I'm in a small shop. And we might have limited or constrained resources. What advice would you give them?
So like, I know this is supposed to be a debate, but I believe, I agree with Celeste, that, our smaller nonprofits are the heart and soul of this industry. They push this industry forward more than we like to realize. And it is important that the organizations that do not have the funds to fully incorporate analytics into their organizations have avenues and pathways to do so. I think one of the best ways that anyone can kind of enter analytics, AI, incorporating that into their organization is to build up the confidence to know that you can do that sort of work. And it doesn't really start with understanding statistics. It doesn't even start with what it means to go ahead and code. What it starts with is understanding how to do research design, how to ask a question that is, again, aligned to where the organization is and where it wants to go, but also at the same time, make sure that question is something that can be answered, right? Again, I'll go back to the point of like our industry is one where it's just filled with emotion. And it's hard to sometimes quantify what that looks like. I'll just mirror Celeste saying, I'm pushing us as fundraising professionals to recognize how to quantify that sort of work, right? What does it look like to make sure that the event went well? What does it look like when we know that the appeal is really hitting heartstrings? Like, what does that actually look like, right? So that starts with fully understanding, the soup to nuts in the sense of how to go ahead and ask a proper research question, how to go ahead and answer that research question in a way that when you do have those insights, they actually tie into something that can move the organization forward. and you can build on. That takes a bit of work. I don't want to sound like it being abstract. It does take some time to fully kind of immerse yourself in that world. But I would say start there, because the coding, the technicals of things, understanding what platforms to use becomes much more easier when you understand what it is to ask the proper questions from an analytics standpoint.
Celeste?
Totally agree. I'll jump in and say I totally agree with Steve. And just because I know we're running short on time, I wanted to say another thing that I have found so helpful in my career, and I know lots of other people have, is peers. Learning from peers through conferences like this, but also less formal groups. And I'm just going to give a shout out to the Canada, for those who don't know, the Toronto Professional Analytics Group, little informal working group. People just get together and they talk about this sort of thing. And to Steve's point, right, think about how to, if you don't know, how to structure a question, how to tackle it, what you might want to be thinking about, what you might want to be cautious of. And that kind of exploration with other people of these ideas is hugely valuable, right? You sitting alone at your desk trying to figure this stuff out is rarely as successful as a half hour spent on a virtual call with your peers.
For those in our audience today wondering, okay, I'm never going to be, let's say, interested in programming or building my own models, what is the one piece of advice you would give them to leave today's talk to go back and really make the most impact in a positive way in their organization with respect to AI and just literacy and being an effective practitioner in this space?
So then I'll leave it at like the basics then. Make sure that your data is correct. Make sure that your data is being inputted in a way that can be pulled for future generations for that organization. Start there. I've always advocated that you don't really need to learn R. You don't really need to learn Python. You kind of do, but you don't really do. You can use Excel. Right, you can look at the numbers and recognize there's a trend happening here. There's something that we need to look into more, right? It just builds a base that you can jump off from properly. Without proper data, without the entire organization buying into how that data should look, you're even with all the fancy models, even with all the fancy techniques, you'll go nowhere, right? And again, this is core to AI, right? Google doesn't do what they do because, they just have a lot of money. They've been doing this for, almost a couple of decades now, where they have built this foundation of proper data governance to get to the point of where they are today as an organization, along with all these other top tech companies. So starting there, again, is part of that building the confidence to get to a point of where you can start to go, all right, our data's straight. I understand what the data's saying. How can I go ahead and unpack that data further to get to a point of fully understanding how to truly leverage it?
Great, Steve. Now, Celeste, before we transition to our next talk, again, what's your top of mind one piece of advice you'd give to our audience today?
I'd really echo what Steve just said. I'd say get familiar with your data and get familiar with your data outside of the database. So like he said, Excel, you can do a lot in Excel, but the most powerful thing you can do in Excel is just look at it and get to know what's truly there and what are the patterns that you can see. And then when you bring in, whether it's an expert, a vendor, a tool, whatever it is on top of that, you have a better sense of what it can and can't do and what you're going to get out of it, and a really better sense of what you're going to use to address the key question. What is the question that you're trying to address? Because that is what really drives it. And I would also urge people to think about other things. We tend to focus on the predictive modeling, the analytics, but there's all kinds of other things AI is doing right now that we don't talk about. Voice recognition, schedule finding, stuff like that I think is coming too. So be open to other aspects of AI that'll actually give you more time to focus on the good stuff.
Well, thank you, Celeste and Steve, for sharing your thoughts. We're going to transition to our other upcoming talk, but there's a lively set of questions coming in through our social Q&A. So check those out and start thinking about some of these responses that we'll do during our Q&A after our next session. So see you shortly. All right, well, without much further ado, it is my distinct pleasure to re-welcome Jenny Johnson, the director of the Family Philanthropy Resource Center at Minneapolis Foundation, and our very own Katie Turcotte, the deputy vice president at George Mason University's Office of Advancement Alumni Relations. So our new second talk is verification necessary or not? Let's dive right in. Katie, from the frontline perspective, all of these new tools and technology, what are your thoughts about this to verify or not verify in resources with frontline gift officers?
Sure. Thanks for that, Roger, and thanks for working with us on the fly to do a little flip today. I like it. I sit in a place where, I've worked at larger organizations who often our research and relationship management team may not be able to deploy themselves against kind of our larger universe. So I kind of sit in a space where I say, information is useful and helpful, and data, especially while screening data, helps us kind of pinpoint and think about where we need to focus our time. On the topic of to verify or not verify, I stand in the space of I don't need all the information. How can my teams help be deployed against the data to do verification for ourselves? So I kind of view the frontline perspective as a group of workforce that can help verify in person, because no matter the research, all the research that our wonderful colleagues can do, I don't always need all the information. We can be a resource to help with verification on the front lines, and sometimes sitting down with a person is going to give you things that no amount of research can find. From privately held assets and the like. So I kind of stand on, let's think about how to deploy time in a useful manner, and how we can be partners with our research and relationship management teams to help with verification when we need to.
Great, thank you, Katie. Jenny, what's your position or perspective on this topic?
Yeah, so first I will say I am Jenny, formerly maybe played by Amy, who I actually thought probably could have done a great job of punting and playing my role today. But I'm really happy that we managed to get everything worked out, and I'm really happy to be here again with Katie and Roger discussing this. So I spent almost 15 years as a frontline fundraiser at smaller health and human service nonprofits before moving to the Minneapolis Foundation. And in my previous roles, I was kind of doing my own, I would say, jerry-rigged prospect research, which just mostly involved Google and what I could discover for myself, right? When coming to the Minneapolis Foundation and having a prospect researcher who is really starting to help with prospect development management, it was, this eye-opening experience for me to see how much more proactive work could get done when I had a partner in the work. And I think in thinking about this topic of, verification and the importance of, whether or not data needs to be completely verified, if we need the complete universe of things, I often have said philanthropy is not burning. There's usually not crisis going on in philanthropy. So if I'm gonna, kind of decide between whether I want something fast or whether I want something verified, I much more want verification. Oftentimes the first gift into a donor-advised fund, which is what I specifically work with at the Minneapolis Foundation, often that gift is the biggest gift from a donor. And so the more verification I can have before going to speak with a prospect, for sure, the better and the better and more fruitful the conversation often will be.
So with this explosive growth of data that's continuing to evolve in our landscape, Katie, how do you think this increase in volume of information it can benefit the front line? What new types of questions do you think we can answer to enhance our fundraising efforts that we couldn't do before?
Right. I think this is the very nuanced role that my colleagues in kind of this field and in this space can really help me. We're in this space of information overload. I and my teams oftentimes, and I would say this for my colleagues that I've worked closely with, is help me and help my teams help themselves. The data and the information and the way it's marshaled, research and relationship and prospect management folks are uniquely qualified to kind of sift through the noise and point us in the right direction, where not all fundraisers are kind of in that space. They're relying on, like Jenny did in other careers, Google. I'm the queen of let me Google that for you as well. And I think there's those places where I can't possibly know everything that there is to know, nor do sometimes I want to know everything that there is to know. So how do you help me help myself and help my teams help themselves to be able to have actionable information to be able to go and make contact? And it's as simple as, yes, there is some kind of capacity there. There may be some other activity that shows that they're willing to talk to us, and good contact information. I think that's the biggest thing that we cry for. But again, I think there's so much more data available now that most of us that sit in my role or in other positions on the front lines aren't savvy in, that that's the unique skill that your membership brings. So really help us marshal that data in a way that gives actionable information that I can use personally, but I can also manage my teams against what we've been given and how we're moving those relationships along.
One of the themes earlier that emerged was this notion of partnership and the use of this information with the front line. Jenny, can you talk about some of the challenges and how your advice to how to overcome building these partnerships with frontline gift officers as a consultant, or bringing information to them to really strengthen that bond and that relationship for the greater good of any organization?
I know this is supposed to be a debate, and I'm going to say, to Katie's point, I agree. Help us help ourselves. It is so true. I think when prospect management can really own their expertise in that space and really come and say, this is good information, you should use this information. Please stop Googling. Please stop Facebook. Please stop looking at LinkedIn. Let's you and I have a conversation about what the information is that you're looking for, and then let's think about some good paths and ways to get to that information. Having that two-way street, I think, is so important. I can even think about times with, the prospect researcher at the Minneapolis Foundation, Jo, who's amazing, love working with her. She will say, yeah, you did not give me enough information to even attempt to figure out what it is that you're looking for. Like just saying a name like Jenny Johnson, not going to get you what you're looking for. So let's have a conversation about what it is, what you know about this person, or maybe it's the opportunity for me to say, yeah, I actually don't really know that much information about this person. Maybe they're not such a good prospect for us right now, but letting it be that two-way street so that, I'm kind of saying what I know. I'm hearing back from prospect research about, all right, this is what's doable, this is what's not. I might not be able to tell you about the quality of a relationship, but I can tell you if a relationship exists, right? So I think it is like having those very real conversations, and for prospect researchers to really own their expertise and push us the way that we need to be pushed, I think.
Katie, Jenny just raised some important points about advocacy and really standing by your work. Can you share maybe your perspectives from the front line about some effective ways that prospect research has negotiated kind of this, yes, I know you want all this information, here's where you really should focus your time and energy?
Right. I think the one thing that as I think of my colleagues that I've worked with, both at where I am now at Mason, but also at George Washington University, I think the one thing for all of us that we don't have unlimited amounts of is time. And so as we think about that, there is this way of remembering how to advocate for what you can do and what's important. Again, I think I've seen gift officers that often will say, well, I need more information. Like, I need to know everything that I could possibly need to know, while a colleague in research is saying, I've given you the basics. Like, do the part that is your job, right? Do the part to go have the conversation, and then come back and let's talk about how we advance. And I know, Jenny and I have laughed as we've prepped with you, Roger, for this, that we're arguing different points. And I know there are values to that, but I do think there is a part on advocacy in the profession. And I think the colleagues that I've had the luxury of working with are hugely competent and have competencies in areas that many of my staff on the front line, including myself, don't have. So you can look at data and help me pinpoint how to focus some time and energy for myself, and I need that. I don't need all the information. And I think it's just as simple as saying, do you really need that? And if they say yes, push them to say, I'm going to give you this. And if you do this step, I'll then give you more. But I will always advocate, and I do this with my team, to say, no, you don't need that. Like, you're going to go find out more if you pick up the phone and call this person and get a visit or have a conversation with them. And I think especially now, we're finding we're getting people to pick up phones and to get on Zoom with us in a way that lets us be invited into their home in ways that we couldn't before. And I think that's that balance of time. So how do you, again, not get focused on getting bogged in all the details, but really think about how you're deploying your resource to help us be able to find the resources we need for the organization. And again, I always just say, help us help ourselves, and additionally, help me think about how to better marshal the intelligence and information we receive in our systems of record in a way that isn't just in a contact report, right? How can we start to make the connections between people and share that in a way holistically with our colleagues that make it accessible to the organization? Again, bringing data that we learn in a way that can be mined, because I don't know how to do that, but I know my colleagues do.
It's definitely a team sport, and I like that you are raising the importance of thinking about the goals and the context of someone's work. So the theme there around making connections with external constituents and how that information will be used. Jenny, what's one piece of advice that you would give to a prospect development professional in our audience today who wants to unlock the most value and growth for their organization after the conference? They're going to take this wisdom from the frontline perspective to inform their work. What should they be thinking about?
Well, that's not a question with a lot of pressure in it, right? Like, what should we take back and act on? So again, I think I go back to like having a relationship with your frontline fundraisers, right? So having that give and take of understanding what it is that the person is looking for, and then being able to give that to them. I go back to kind of, again, a topic of this was around verification, right? So thinking about how much of the universe do we want to know? How important is it to me to have a ton of verified information? Again, philanthropy, typically not in crisis. So I'm looking for more verified and more correct than fast. I think that I sit in a different place though, and when I was a frontline fundraiser, I was looking for fast more than perfect. And I would say now I'm more looking for you know, what's the information we really know, and how can this kind of help me move forward? When I really think about what's been most helpful, it's really been relationship mapping. So just the ability to rely on Joe being able to help us think about, this is a prospect that we think, based on everything we generally know, seems like they should be at the Minneapolis Foundation. Who do we know that they know? And again, I don't need quality of relationship, because I think, you know, how is anybody really going to figure that out? I don't need that. What I need is, I know that our board member also knows this person. And then I think that's on me to then pick up the phone, call the prospect or call the board member, ask them about what their relationship is like, and then advance the prospect kind of based on, you know, whatever knowledge or information I get. But I by no means think, prospect management, you should be able to tell me, yes, these two people went to college together and now they serve on a board together and their kids play t-ball together. I don't expect that. But again, just the ability to say, yeah, for sure, they serve on a board together. I also think, and we've talked about this a little bit, in looking towards the future and kind of where fundraising is headed, and where I think prospect management can help in really helping fundraisers narrow the scope of what they're looking for in these next 6 months to a year. I think it's going to be about what are the industries that donors are supporting right now. So I would give this as an example. I work at the Minneapolis Foundation. We of course had COVID-19, as did everybody, in March, but then at the end of May we also had George Floyd was murdered. And so in the last probably 4 to 5 months, the way that our donors have been giving money to the community looks much different than it did a year ago. So we've seen a lot more health and human service organizations raising money, a lot more people running to food, running to housing, running to emergency services. And so where I think fundraisers or prospect researchers are going to be really helpful is in saying, here are the nonprofit issue areas and industries that are still being highly supported. How can we help you, frontline fundraisers, cater your proposals towards the types of things that donors want to be funding right now? So I think that'll be hugely helpful in these next months.
Thank you, Jenny. Those are great points. Katie, do you have anything else to add about the current economic conditions and the place that we're finding ourselves in right now?
I think Jenny, from her perspective, the community foundation is thinking about funds being deployed to support certain areas. The other place where I sit is which sectors are not being negatively impacted, right? Which of our donors are not being negatively impacted by COVID-19 and our current circumstances.
Hi, Katie. It's Amy again. I just want to chime in that for some reason your audio just is getting worse. So I know we're having, I think Mark thought there was a helicopter flying over your house earlier maybe. So we just want to check to see if there's any way to change up your audio. If there's something have changed in the last 15 minutes, it just sounds like your audio has changed.
This is so bad.
Yes, it's still bad. So Roger, I think we're towards the end of this conversation, right? So I think what we'll do is, Katie, we'll make sure we get your thoughts through the posts, and I know that we could definitely do a quick recording as well. So Roger, if you want to wrap up any thoughts with Jenny, and then we could definitely answer some questions.
Sure.
Katie, then I just ask you to maybe do your question through chat. That way we'll be able to hear you completely, just in case if there was another helicopter dropping off some goodies. So Roger, I'll turn it back to you.
Sure. Jenny, I guess one of the themes were when you talked about giving patterns in light of the economic conditions and where people are giving their money. I know that from the frontline perspective as well. I was picking up from Katie's through the audio that it's also important to keep in mind who's doing well. There are going to be certain industries, right, with these economic conditions that that our prospect development professionals and researchers should keep an eye on. So with that, I'm going to thank you both for your time, despite some of the technical hurdles. Thank you for your flexibility, and I'm going to move us over to QA because we have this bustling social Q&A stuff. So I'm going to invite Celeste and Steve back. Burning question, and I'll throw this out to Celeste first. Are donors generally aware of the use of AI in fundraising? And if not, do you think they should be made aware?
That's a really good question. I don't think most donors are aware, like in the sense that they don't think about it explicitly. But what I do think is that they're increasingly expecting the benefits of AI in their charitable giving as well as their other world. I always go to this example of, we used to be creeped out when Google Ads started to tailor to our searches. And now I find a lot of us actually more get annoyed if it doesn't do a good job of tailoring ads to our searches and who we are. It's like, that's the wrong ad for me, right? And I think donors are going to increasingly expect that from charities. We talk a lot about data integration and understand the full picture of a donor's involvement with a charity. They expect we know all that, and frankly, if they like to give at certain times of the year, they expect we're picking up on those cues. So I think that's something we're going to have to be responsive to. Whether or not we call it AI or we just call it, really good data management is, I think, up to us, because they're basically the same thing. But I think that's the bigger question. What are donors expecting?
Right. Oh yeah, please, Steve.
Yeah, no, I think that's an unbelievable point, because we are not just beholden to our constituents who the organizations are serving, but we're also beholden to the donors, particularly the bigger name, bigger dollar donors within our organizations. For the most part, those individuals want to see that we are capable of being able to pivot, being able to leverage everything that we have within our organizations, so that they know that their investment into the organization is being used in a proper way. So I absolutely love that point of making sure that that at least our bigger name donors understand the full capabilities of the organization when it comes down to being able to leverage the data.
Thank you, Celeste and Steve. For frontline presenters, as a quick rundown, Jenny, what are the top 3 data points you want verified as a frontline relationship manager?
Top 3. So like I said, again, relationships. Who do they know that we know? Who's going to open that door for me? And what is that? What does that really look like? Like, what's the information we have around that? I would say that's number 1. I think in a community foundation, from that perspective, what is their capacity, right? Really, what does that kind of wealth screen look like? What does the capacity look like? It'll help us figure out who the best relationship manager is for that potential prospect. And then number 3, where else are they giving? So what are the other areas that this donor prospect is supporting? Because again, that will also help us kind of curate who is going to be the best relationship manager to really work with the donor. So I would say those are my 3 from a community foundation perspective. Super interested for Katie if she has other thoughts from a education perspective.
Katie, we can give it a try, but if it goes into Megatron garble, oh yeah, no, you still sound like a robot.
You're more than welcome to use the chat.
Sure.
If you also text me your answer, I'm happy to put it in the chat as well, Katie.
Look at this pivot and all this flexibility. 5 months in, we're experts in video conferencing, and we will pivot. Celeste and Steve, can you suggest a starter resource to understand AI and fundraising, as this is a new idea to me? Thanks.
Steve.
Yeah. I'm thinking.
Good book, anything.
Yeah. No. Oh boy. Okay. So, I can't stress enough for you to be at a point where you are trying to understand AI. It is a tall order. It is almost like the last level of a video game when it comes down to analytics, right? To understand how to properly implement AI. I would not suggest that you try to understand AI. I would suggest that you try to understand the guts of AI. To that end, there is absolutely nothing wrong with statistics for dummies or analytics for dummies. Any sort of book that speaks to you in plain language what correlations are, what regressions are, just even your basic statistics. I think there needs to be, so you need to build that foundation and base first before you get to a point of fully understanding how to understand AI. Now, I get it, right? This is definitely a tall order even in itself. So I'll go ahead and take some of Celeste's advice, which is if you're unable to really spend that time truly learning it, speak to a colleague who actually is in that work, who can kind of break down why you're interested in AI, and speak to that in plain language in a way for you to fully grasp exactly what you're interested in.
Totally agree with Steve on all that. I'm going to give a shout out to a few other resources, just because oldie but a goodie, Josh Burkholtz's book about fundraising analytics is actually a really good place to start if you really want to get back to the basics. And his blog is another great place. Also, Kevin we say McDonnell, I think it's McDonnell is how he pronounces it. His blog, Cool Data, fantastic place. Again, it's about data science, but this is the building blocks of AI, which is really where I would endorse you start. Some general books about AI, kind of like approachable, reader-friendly stuff. It doesn't have to be about AI and fundraising. Think about AI. Actually, what I encourage people to think about is, what is AI doing in our world right now? Understand that, and then you'll start to see, frankly, the gaps is what we're seeing in the fundraising world, like where we need to be and where we need to catch up to other industries. And then if you are in kind of the second rung, I just got to give a shout out to a book I keep on my desk, and it's not because he's the moderator, Data Science. I really do. Just because, you know, it's a great little reference every once in a while. Roger, one of the authors on that. But I would definitely call that second level after you've kind of mastered some of these. Hope that helps.
And shout out to co-author Ashutosh Nandeshwar,
Yes.
who's with us somewhere in the virtual cloud. Well, in
Yes.
light of time and to keep you all on schedule, a session handout's been prepared in advance for downloading at your convenience, which includes references and links to some Apra resources that we thought you might find helpful. As we wrap up Apra Talks, I'd like to thank each of you for sharing your expertise, your time, your insights and perspectives with us today. As your Apra Talks moderator, I'd also like to thank the Apra board, our international network of member-tiers, that's a new word, chapter leaders, committee chairs, and the thought leaders who really make up this robust, thoughtful, and incredibly fashionable Apra community. Many thanks, of course, to all of our sponsors, Apra headquarters and staff working diligently behind the scenes, and our incredible volunteers who helped make today possible, and each of you as session participants for joining us.